We have a very distinguished scholar, Dr. Rabi Mohtar, who is going to be making our presentation today. If you have questions, there is a chat option, and so please put your questions in the chat, and hopefully he'll be able to get to as many of those as possible. However, with that in mind, let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Mohtar so that he can go ahead and get started, because we are all so excited to hear what he has to say on such a very interesting topic. Dr. Professor Rabi Mohtar from the Department of Biological and Agriculture Engineering and the Zachary Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Texas A&M University founded the Texas A&M Water, Energy, Food Nexus Initiative in 2015. He served as Dean of Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences from 2018 to 21 at the American University in Beirut, where he also established the Water, Energy, Food, Health Nexus Renewable Resources Initiative. He was at Purdue from 1996 to 2014, and he was the inaugural director of Purdue's Global Engineering Program and a founding member of Purdue's Division of Environmental and Ecological Engineering. Dr. Mohtar's research focuses on global resource challenges and development of a water, energy, food nexus framework for linking science and policy, characterization of the soil, water, medium, and efficiency of non-traditional water, and applications for sustainable integrated water management, such as implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. He serves also as the governor of the World Water Council, is an executive board member of IWRA, a distinguished alumni of ABU, senior fellow at the Policy Center for New South, and a fellow of the American Society of Agriculture and Biological Engineering. And so we're so pleased and so happy and so honored to have him speak with all of you today. And so with that in mind, Dr. Mohtar, we turn it over to you.
Ambassador Boss, thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'd like also to thank our inspiration and leadership of Dr. Morano, who has been supporting a lot of our effort in this area. So thank you so much, Ambassador Boss. And I'm really delighted to be here and to talk about a topic that is very timely for all of us. On Wednesday, yesterday, we had our regular monthly meeting of the Infuse project, which will lead me here at Purdue, and I was talking about this opportunity. And the exciting thing, that exciting and not exciting at the same time, that people were asking, why don't we do this work here? Because there's a lot of desert food in our country here, and we need to look at the trade-offs that existing today in some of our communities. Thank you for that opportunity. So today I'd like to report on a project that was funded by FAO. I'd like to acknowledge the project team, Dr. Sandra Yenni at AUB, Dr. Rola Bashur at AUB, Dr. Basil Dahir here at A&M and the Energy Institute, and Dr. Sasha Kooshima, who's the head of the Land and Water Division at FAO. I'll be talking a little bit about the background motivation of this work, some of the questions that we had in mind, and we'll talk about methodology. In terms of the implementation, we'll focus on Lebanon as a case study and what implications that has into other dry land, and some of the results and the trade-off. And I'd like to conclude with some policy implications to this work that we felt that could be very, very relevant. Very brief introduction into our group. We do research in the development of platforms for water, energy, food, health, both in terms of the research and to looking into some of the interlinkages and developing some platforms for allowing policymakers to make better decision-making when it comes to managing these primary resources. We do also significant amount of work on green water accounting. This is the water resource that is the soil water known by many of us, that is not too much highlighted in many of the body of literature, but it also is ignored by many of the policy and funding platforms. I think this is something that I'd like to highlight here in this platform, that green water more than 2/3 of our food supply, especially with grain, is coming with rain-fed agriculture. And yet we don't give this a proper attention. Last, also, we focus on non-traditional water. Green water is one of them, but there are other recycling, reuse. There's a lot of technological issues we deal with, but there's also a lot of perception and acceptance issues among farmers and among consumers. We do a lot of extension and engagement activity in Texas and the world, and we engage a lot in Region L, trying to disseminate some of the system solutions to some of these communities. Last but not least, which is very dear to my heart, is a global service learning, which we are working on here at A&M in partnership with many overseas institutions, trying to take our students abroad in a capstone learning experience that expanded their horizon and allow them to really engage with other partners across the world. There's also a course for those of you interested, a graduate course that we're also offering every spring semester in the Water and Energy Food Nexus. So about the timing of this work, it's very interesting that for the first time, I see that the Congress at their 117th session approved a bill that establishes a conference on food, nutrition, hunger, and health. That is a very recent bill. It's September 22 of previous month. The background is very interesting because we are talking about hunger, we're talking about nutrition, and we're talking about health and food, and that those are issues that can be solved. The access to the healthy food is a priority for every individual, and it's looking at the root cause to end hunger. This is not in a developing country. This is here, and I'm really delighted that we're looking at some of the root causes and how do we develop a protocol to end hunger. I don't know what the relevance of this with the SDGs, but we're looking at also the US is looking, as any other country, as looking at the SDG, and this fit right there into hitting many of the SDGs at one time with this initiative. So in a year and a half, the Congress is urging the implementation or the execution of having this conference that will focus on 5 areas: identification of impact of COVID on the food and nutrition insecurity, and looking at areas of weakness in the food system, and the impact of racial, urban, rural, and geographic disparity on hunger, and looking at identifying viable solutions for ending hunger. Last but not least, identifying the agencies and ensuring greater coordination among these related programs. So here we are, why this work is very timely in our backyard. And I'm very pleased to see that this is a focus that is happening here. I'd like to, as a background, and this is a global view of the primary resources. Yes, we do have gaps in water, we do have gaps in food, we do have gaps in energy, and as such, we have what I call human insecurity when it comes to health and nutrition. But there's not only the gaps that is worrying me, it's also the interlinkages of the highly interlinked system. So one shortage of one of these resources will trigger insecurity in the other. So the challenges that we see is the inequity and inequality and the variability in the distribution of these resources. We do have enough food globally as a quantity, but the distribution and inequity of the distribution is the problem. But we also have management issues. At the core of that is the allocation model for managing these resources has failed us. And we could give many examples. At home here, we could look into regional in Texas, the allocation of water, for example, to the energy, to the food, agriculture, and to the municipalities. That model, allocative model, is not going to work. It's not going to really get us where we need to be. Nationally, the Colorado River allocative model is also failing us, and we need to look at a different model, which is based on values and based on synergy among these sectors. Other example is what we see the conflict today in the Nile River Basin with Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan and other basin countries, which is basically based on that allocative model. So we need to look beyond the allocative model and see, are there synergistic models that look into the system approach solutions that allow us to find creative out-of-the-box solution to these crises, in particular water and food crisis. We have non-sustainable consumption in many parts of the world. We have also looking into extreme and non-stationarity due to the climate change. And of course, I talked about the non-sustainable business model. And I'm self-critical here. We need to develop more circular food and agriculture systems that will be sustainable for the future. So we have an opportunity to build a business model based on values, based on a different synergistic model, but also that allow us to build more resilient and sustainable communities. So to get there, we need a different type of thinking. We need a system thinking that transcends the silos of the water, energy, food, that transcends the excellence that has been done in these silos. I don't think we need to replace, but we need to develop the framework to synergize. I think integrated water resources management, energy efficiency, sustainable diets, and food production has served us extremely well. But what we need is a system that integrates, that develop a quantification, but also that help us move beyond the analytics and move into actionable solution and actionable knowledge. And that is something that I'd like to explore in the rest of the presentation. So it is what I call a complex system opposed to complicated system. This is not a complicated system. It can be complicated, but it's a complex system that has a web of interactions, that has a lot of non-stationarity, that is not only bounded by the biophysical system, but it's also looking into the social mosaic and the socioeconomics and people, which makes it extremely difficult to manage. And that's why we label this as a complex system that needs to be addressed and looked at. These system approaches allow us to first understand. I think we are still at that beginning of this understanding of these complexities. I think that as a first step after we do these understanding and understand how the system behaves, I think the target need to be reduce the interdependencies of these primary sources. I'll give you an example. So today, if we have a crisis in water, we're going to induce a crisis in food, and we're going to induce a crisis in energy. And that was very obvious in Texas here last year when we had the failure of all these systems because of the interdependencies that we see. I know that water and food, for example, which is at the heart of most of what we do in this food and agriculture system community, are extremely tightly connected, with 2/3 of that fresh water going to food production. So ideally, we need to reduce that interdependencies, and that will allow us to build more resilient communities. And that also allow us to promote ecosystem and human health and well-being. So that's what the system approach is intended. It's built to do. And I think making this even connection grow globally, I think these systems are essential for achieving the sustainable development goals, which all countries are struggling to develop these plans. And it cannot be solved by one sector alone. It has to be solved with dialogue, with looking at a multi-sectoral and inclusive discussions and dialogue, looking at the interdependencies, looking at the trade-offs, and looking at plans that by fixing one of these SDGs, you're not disrupting the other SDGs. Focusing back into the project, the research questions are actually 5 overarching research questions. These are large questions if you think about them. But that's what this kind of the background research questions we have for this. Can the country sustainably produce its own Mediterranean food basket? So we know that traditionally Mediterranean food is a healthy diet. It's not only healthy for the human being, but it's also healthy for the ecosystem, as discussed and elaborated by the Eat Lancet report that was published in 2019. So we know that, but can we in Lebanon, this is back to the case study that we built as a sample case study for these research questions, can we sustainably produce our own Mediterranean food diet? And how much is the population are adhering to that Mediterranean food diet? That's another question which we address. I will not talk about it today, but this is another question that was also raised. How to introduce nutrition and food quality in this Nexus security framework. We've been working on the water, energy, food for a number of years, and introducing nutrition and food quality was not a trivial task. because we're not only interested in the biomass production, as typically done in the many of the models. We're looking at what nutritional value we add and how much that is adding to the food quality of the population. Again, I talked about trade-offs. There is trade-off, and we need to explicitly quantify these trade-offs. So what are these trade-offs between the water productivity, energy, and water efficiency and nutritional value food? There are trade-offs in the production, and that implies choices of crops, that employs choices of management system that needs to be looked at. The fourth question is is what actually appears in the title, which I think extremely relevant for many of the drylands. Many of the drylands are suffering from food insecurity, but at the same time they need the cash for their income. So can we use these tools to have this a quantification of these trade-offs so that we develop a roadmap for these nations wherever is needed to make that balance? And in fact, this triggered the discussion we had yesterday in our Infuse project. Can we do this trade-off in the food desert in some of the communities in our cities? And the answer is, of course, yes. It takes a different governing structure for how water, food, and energy are managed. But I think this is a very relevant question for us here as well. Last but not least, are there policies for land use and allocation of the cropping system that can incentivize the producers to use some of these recommendations from this? In fact, this number 5, we're still working on a series of policy briefs and looking at engaging the policymakers in that discussion, working again with our partner with FAO, both in Rome and the regional and the local office. With these research questions, I'd like to kind of introduce first the background of the case study, looking into what are we looking for in Lebanon. So Lebanon, many of you are familiar with the economic crisis. Before that, it was an influx of refugees, and we'll talk a little bit about the numbers later. And also, all of these have put pressure on the natural resources in terms of water and in energy. Food, unfortunately, we import most of the food, about 80% as of last year, before the meltdown of the economy. And I think that those numbers may have changed over the last 18 months. The increased reliance on imported food is a big issue. So the domestic food only satisfies 20% of the demand, and mostly is in fruits and vegetables. And you'll see in a minute what the distribution look like. The challenge in increasing that food local production is the gap that we have in water and in energy. We import most of our energy, and we don't have a lot of water that goes around, assuming that there are no reform to how we produce food in the system using more efficient water systems. According to the last report by the McKinsey, which done a few years ago in Lebanon, the agriculture constitutes only 3 to 4% of the GDP. I very much disagree with that. I think that includes only the tradable commodities. I think there are many issues that the report did not include, that include the social mosaic, that include the livelihood, that include the biodiversity. So if you include all of those, what the food and agriculture system community constitute, I would argue that this figure would be triple that, 3 to 4%. But again, this is a different discussion. Having said that, I think we need to be a little bit self-critical in terms of having different way of interacting with our resources, have a resource use sector that uses more efficiently our water, energy, and land, and look at trade-off in these resources and how we can look at different allocation and reallocation to increase the efficiency. Zooming into a little bit more, water is a diminishing renewable resource for many reasons. And I would say population demography is one big one. The refugee and the population increase is another big issue. And then let's not forget that the majority of that water, more than 60% of that water goes to food production. And this is a big issue in terms of having a more improved water use efficiency. And this is something that we'll talk about later. 50 to 80% of agriculture is irrigated. Now, the reason for that is because most of the The arable land is in the Bekaa Valley, which does not receive a lot of rainfall. Of course, irrigation water, as the case for any other country, is very low as compared to the cost of the production of water. So it's 10 cents per cubic meter. And we all know that the cost of producing that water is much higher. It can go up to $1 to $2, depending on where you are. We're not an energy producing country. So the energy in terms of the majority is diesel and gasoline for that supplies the energy agriculture. And that's 9% of the total demand for the energy in the country. Now, I'd like to stop here. And in an earlier study, we've proven that more than 20% of the electricity need for the country, especially in rural areas, can be provided by hydropower. Now, of course, that's a different story. And we've got also a lot of potential for solar, but those are not exploited. And the current situation is that the majority, 96%, are provided by fossil fuel. And this is another big discussion, which I will not get into. In terms of land, it's a 10,400 square kilometer. About 22% of that is cultivated. The challenge is the fragmentation of the land. And you see the map here, the majority of the agricultural land, more than 42%, more than 40% of that is in the Bekaa Valley, where the production of most of the food commodity come from. Again, the fragmentation is a big issue, as many of the developing countries, 70% of farmers own less than 1 hectare, which is a big problem for mechanization. It's a big problem for many of the large-scale farming that are needed to make economy of scale. This is not an up-to-date figure. This was back in the census 2015. I haven't seen a new figure, but the refugees figure is the undocumented. This is the official UN data, but the unofficial exceeds 2 million and probably much more than that. And the irony of this also, unlike many other countries in the region, like Jordan, like Turkey, where refugees are concentrated in camps, in Lebanon, they're spread all over the country. That, in a way, that maybe diffuses the pressure on some of these communities, but also it makes the access to international aid very, very difficult. But that's another question for another time. But this is the reality that we have today. So specifically, the objectives of this study is to identify, quantify the critical interconnections between the water, energy, food, nutrition system in Lebanon, develop a framework to assess the trade-offs that we talked about earlier. Last but not least is to evaluate the farmer's perception about willingness to implement. I will not talk about this the third because it's another plan that I'm not willing to open today, but it impacts how we proceed very much because the majority of the recommendation that we'll talk about will require buy-in from the producers. And we had a pretty good idea where they are. Some of their perception of risk is false, and there's a lot of awareness that need to be made about water reuse, about the perception of some of the dry land farming, for example. Yes, it is a low output, but also it's a low input. And so there's a lot of perception there that I will not talk about. I'd like to start the methodology by highlighting something that is seldom highlighted in many of our studies, which is soil. Soil is at the heart of water, food, air, climate, and nutrition security, believe it or not. Of course, a lot of the water, it's a purifier for many of the streams that we have, so we need to protect it from pollution, but it's also a house for the majority of the water we receive in rain-fed agriculture. It's also a place where it's a living entity that allows us to breathe cleaner air. And we're more and more realizing the importance of good soil management with sequestration and the impact on climate change. And of course, at the bottom of all of that is human security that ends with nutrition and health. So soil is important, and soil was central to all of the work that we conducted. It's there as a foundation, and I'd like to highlight it before we get started with this data. In our study, we looked at 33 crops that constitute the Mediterranean diet. We focus on few of those that are more what is mostly planted in the region. And we selected those based on, not only based on the prevalence, but based on the nutrition. And I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean here. So the next slide actually will tell the story that I want to share. This is a very fundamental to the study that we conducted. In making sure that we look at these trade-offs, we were looking at not only at the production side, but also looking at the nutrition and health side. So what you see here is the protein content of the different crops along with the water use. So ideally, we want to be at the bottom right-hand side of the figure where you have a high protein content with low water footprint. Those would be examples: dry beans, almond, sometimes a lot of the walnut. The walnut here is not included because a lot of it in Lebanon is consumed and sold as fresh. And we want to be at that zone, even though some would argue that if you look at the fruits and vegetables have additional health benefit in terms of the antioxidant and other nutritional value. But for the focus of this study, we focus on protein. We looked at protein as the criteria for nutrition for the food basket. Having said that, fruits and vegetables are in abundance in Lebanon because we produce more than the demand, and a lot of it is exported. But this gives you an idea of where our starting point in terms of the water footprint of these commodities and their importance in the diet itself. And that's going to guide a lot of the discussion later when it comes to the allocation of these crops and how do we make use of the water footprint dynamics and the trade-off that I am talking about. So let me take a bird's eye view on the methodology and start with building that framework that we talked about, that Nexus tool. So starting with the food choice in terms of the water footprint, in terms of the nutritional value, and in terms of the amount you produce. Now the food, of course, there is an imported food and in the basket, and there's also a locally produced in that basket. And we account for both. We account for the land footprint, the energy footprint, the water footprint, and the nutritional outcome of all of that food. When it comes to the water, you have the choice to use a treated wastewater, which we are actually exploring further. It's not heavily, it is used, but it's not regulated, at least in Lebanon. And this is something that needs to be globally. In fact, we have a European grant funded by CREMA to look exactly into this. And the USAID helped build that infrastructure for wastewater reuse at the AUB farm in the Bekaa Valley. So looking at treated wastewater as an alternative water, of course, you always have the groundwater and the surface water. The problem in the groundwater is that the groundwater table is getting, the withdrawal is much more than the recharge, and the water table is going down and down every year. And that constitutes additional pumping, which also links to the energy. The energy we explored currently is diesel and gasoline, but we looked into two other options, solar and wind. Now, one other thing that we looked at, it may not be trivial. It is not trivial for Lebanon. It may be trivial for other locations. We had to do energy conversion because every day when we were conducting that study, you could look at the exchange rate between the local currency, the Lebanese lira, and the US dollar. It started 1,500 Lebanese lira per dollar when we started this work. And today it approached 20, I don't know what is it today, but it may be in the 15,000 for the lira. So you could see the importance of the currency conversions, accounting for it as one of the scenarios that we looked at, because it has a significant impact on the production cost. Remember, most of the fertilizer is coming from the outside. Most of the chemicals, the agrochemicals that are used on farm is coming from the outside. So the currency conversion is extremely important. And as such, that farmers would like to bring in fresh dollars to their farms so that they can maintain that operation. So the energy conversions module is very relevant here and is very important for us in these scenarios. So when you look at the middle of that, here is the analytics, where we look at taking these scenarios and converting all of the analytics into what does it mean in terms of the interactions of the water, the energy, the food for each of these possibilities. And of course, we have the output that we analyze the water footprint, the land footprint, energy cost, emissions, reliance, reliance is an entity that, or is an outcome, which is the reliance on imported food. Reliance on imported food is because one of the questions we were asking is, can Lebanon survive with its own local production? So the reliance, and then this is an output, an important output that we looked at. Of course, the nutrition is something that we tracked all along. And when you look at these output, there are some trade-offs, and the trade-offs need to be looked at in a way that will guide the stakeholder to make the right decision. Now, the stakeholder here is not only the policymaker. The stakeholder could be the producer themselves. It could be someone who's in the water sector, selling water or selling energy, or it could be the local. So there's a local middle person for the food, for the distribution. So many of these could be the stakeholders that we could engage. So that's an overall methodology of the work, zooming in a little bit more on these scenarios and the Excel sheets that feed into the computation. And we have three types of scenarios. One, the first type of scenario is to increase self-sufficiency and the trade-off between self-sufficiency on the Mediterranean diet locally versus the imported food. This is a very tricky issue that we had to deal with because we cannot enforce it. I mean, all what you could do at the end of the day is to educate and make those numbers more aware, because whatever farmers do, whatever the import does, it impacts the local food prices and it impacts the self-sufficiency and the food security for the locals. The second class of scenarios we looked at is the conventional water sources versus treated wastewater. And that's also important for the sustainability and for the circularity of the food and agriculture system. Last but not least, we were looking into exploring renewable energy. And again, that renewable energy, it may not be cost effective today because most of these solar panels are imported. And unless the government invest in locally produced technology, it's not going to become an option for many, many of these farmers. Now, they're forced to today because there is no fossil fuel. There's no, and that's also part of the meltdown of the economy. There's no fossil fuel available for farmers. So some of them were forced to look at other options. And I know several are looking into wind and solar as we speak. In terms of the trade-off analysis, the output needed are the irrigated water footprint, the energy requirement, the emission, the nutrition, the cost, and the land requirement. So let's dig into a bit more into these scenarios and see what does that mean as far as outcome. So again, our base scenario was in 2017, which rely 80% reliance on the imported food. And we want to change that base scenario. We kept everything the same. The water is coming from groundwater, 80% of it, 20% solar, surface. We have diesel, 100% diesel operated water system and the irrigation system and all the on-farm operation. The food energy is 70% diesel, 30% gasoline, again, similar to 2017. And the currency conversion, this is what it used to be in 2019, which is 15 Lebanese lira per dollar. What we changed from the 2017 base scenario is the increasing green bean, broad bean, lentils, chickpea, and peas, both dry and green, which is crucial to the Mediterranean diet, 100% self-sufficient. And you see here, the reliance is significantly reduced to 2.8%. However, we have an increase in our water footprint, significant increase in water footprint, in energy footprint, and in land, and of course, increase in the emissions, because you're producing more locally and using the non-traditional or using traditional fossil fuel for the farm operation. So the emissions went up. Of course, we had a positive index when it comes to nutrition because we were able to produce locally at an affordable price more of the nutritious food that's part of the food basket. So looking at the previous scenario, we added another scenario, which is the decrease in the production of crops with more than 100% self-sufficiency. What did that mean? So the excess in tomato used to be imported, used to be exported to bring fresh dollars. So in here, we removed all of the import. And we relied heavily on the question is having all of the food to be consumed locally. Of course, our reliance, we had less money coming in, and our local food production, our water footprint was reduced because we decreased that food production. And of course, because of the less cash, people did not have money to purchase additional commodities. So we had other issues in terms of the farm and the GDP. In terms of land, we had less land requirement as compared to the first, but still we had a significant increase in land. So let's say we kept everything as the earlier scenario, but we did account for the currency conversion and look at everything becomes insignificant. All of the numbers did not change, except that the cost of production went 100%, more than 100% up. And I'm sad to tell you that today, the dollar did not stay at the 4,000 Lebanese lira per pound. Today is at the 15, approaching 20. So that cost of production is even much more than what you see here. So that's the dilemma that we were looking at. So if we looked at now at another scenario, which is looking at changing the energy mix by having a renewable energy, again, with the treated wastewater and plus the currency fluctuation, the whole picture changes, because now our production cost is a little bit less because we are relying on renewable energy. We're relying a little bit more on treated wastewater. So there is a shift in how we perceive or how we look at this outcome when it comes to these scenarios. Again, we use the currency conversion, $1 equivalent to 4,000, which is not the reality today. So if we have to redo the analysis today with the current conversion, the outcome will be extremely different than what you see today. With all of this, I'd like to spend the last several minutes. I want to actually, this is not going to be this is going to be an extensive part of the discussion that I'd like to share with you is what does that all mean? I think we need to really reflect and answer the questions we started earlier. What does that all mean? I could say that at least we have developed a roadmap for sustainability of the Lebanese Mediterranean diet. We don't have the answers, but we have the platform that allow us to look into answers, especially that the situation is very fluid, is very dynamic, and we could not give recommendations without having to go into the biggest elephant in the room, which is the conversion rate. But we have that platform that can allow us to engage in dialogue with the stakeholders. Also, within the scope of the investigated food basket, we did not take the 33 element, we only took a subset of that. Lebanon has the potential to be more food and nutrition secure. And this is something that I'd like to highlight, bold, that this is possible. There has to be a 3-tier approach to what I'm going to say. Reallocation within the existing resource pie, increasing that resource pie, and creating the environment for more incentivizing the reallocation and the expansion of the resource pie. That creation of the environment involve several, in fact, all of these 3 tiers involve several interventions. It includes improvement in technology. We looked at today, our water use efficiency, the water use efficiency in many of these farms is way below the global water use efficiency. Many of them still use canals, open channel canals, and they use inefficient system because it costs a lot of money initially to build an efficient water system. And many of these farmers at the 1 hectare scale, average farm, they're not gonna do it. So there is a technology that needs to improving efficiency through technologies, but there's also has to be policies to incentivize investment in agriculture. But this needs to be accounted for as part of that trade-off. And I think the trade-off need to be looked at with new water technology, with new energy interfaces technology, and with new land use. Our productivity in that farm that we surveyed is not as high as it should be. And of course, we have to look into carbon emission. The big elephant in the room, again, is the currency conversion. This is very critical. It's very difficult to account for, especially the situation is very fluid, but it's something that needs to be looked at and considered in any future intervention. Again, we did look into the analysis can help us answer the big question is, do we produce for self-sufficiency or we produce for economic development? This is a question that's out there. that I think will be with us. And this is not only relevant for Lebanon, this is relevant to many of the dry land around the world that are suffering from lack of currency, the GDP needing a boost, but at the same time that the people are hungry. So you've got local demand for food. It's a dilemma that we need to address. I'd like to highlight the system and the nexus of this and the trade-off and the cross-sectoral dialogue that is needed. We needed to speak to the water community because food security impacts them. We needed to speak to the energy community because we need the energy to mobilize the agricultural food sector in terms of the operations on the farm, in terms of the pumping, in terms of the storage and transport. So a cross-sectoral dialogue for answering these questions need to happen. And very little of that is happening. And as you could see, as across the globe, many of these sectors work in silos and there are no dialogue among them. So I'm hoping that this platform that we build will create that platform for this dialogue across these sectors. This dialogue can and should play a role in informing policymaking. And again, I mentioned earlier the UN SDGs. This is an opportunity for the science community to engage with the policymakers at the national scale, that there are tools out there, there are knowledge out there that can help better achieve the SDGs, not as a single SDG alone, but as a bundle, because you don't want to fix one and create issues with others. I would like to close with that last statement that yes, we did the analysis that I shared with you here is specific to Lebanon, but it can be replicated to other countries in the region and other dry land and in food desert here in the US. I believe this is the last slide. Thank you very much. I hope that this was useful. Thank you so much.
Dr. Mohtar, thank you so very much for that very informative and interesting presentation. I know and see that we do have time for some questions. Dr. Byers had put a question in the chat about the number of
I don't recall, but they are in the tens, not in the single digit. There are, I don't recall the exact figures, but there are tens of surveys that went out that were analyzed. This section of the study is not completed yet, but we have tens of surveys that are being looked at in terms of the acceptance, to both looking at a different cropping system. But okay, I had some help from my colleagues in the team. They said 200 farmers. Thank you, Basil. Thank you, Sandra. 200 farmers were surveyed.
Excellent, excellent. If there are other questions, either you can put it in the chat or you can actually go ahead and speak to Dr. Mohtar directly.
This is Gary Briers, and I'm a social scientist in agriculture and was the one who posted the idea about how many farmers were involved with this, specifically because it's about feeding people. And one of the things is about feeding people. Obviously, increasing their economic wherewithal, et cetera, is also that. But not just the number of farmers, but then who those farmers are. Are they women? Are they men? Is child labor on farms a big thing? What are the educational levels of the farmers? If we're talking about a change in behavior, much of that change in behavior, I believe, must come on the part of the farmers. And if on the average they farm 1.5 hectares, they're very small farms, and there must be a bunch of farmers.
Yes. Now, it's a different, the average is less than 5 hectares. The average is about 1.5 hectares. Most of these farms, as you said, are very small, mostly by male. But there is a new system emerging in Lebanon, which I'm not sure I'm happy with, but so it's going back to labor farms. So it's a very complicated system, as you mentioned, but there are additional things that are happening in Lebanon. Many of the refugees are involved in the farm workers. Many of the large farmers are employing the small farmers. So there's emergence of hierarchy in the farming system, which makes the the adoption a bit more complicated. You're absolutely right. I don't think we understand that complexity, the behavior, and this has to be with us for a while until we understand the human behavior and why they do what they do. But at the bottom line is your earlier statement is very appropriate here. We need to feed people, but what you tell to a farmer who doesn't have the cash to go and buy books and supplies for their family. So there's a dilemma that they're going through, a dilemma between feeding and between generating that cash that they need for other commodities.
Well, I agree very, very strongly with your suggestion that this study could be replicated in many, many other countries, because many other countries are faced with similar kinds of, be they desert countries or tropical, they still have similar kinds of problems.
Thank you, Gary.
Dr. Jones.
Yeah, I wanted to first of all compliment you, Rabi, because as you know, I really support the kind of work that you're doing, and you've done a very good job of showing the different trade-offs among the different components and how prices, but also land availability and water and energy fit into the picture as well. You know, building on the food, energy, and water nexus that you and I have both been involved in. One thing I had a question. Oh, two questions I had. You talked about health also, and I didn't see very much analysis that would really reflect the indicators and the outcomes from health changes in health outcomes to the different practices that you were comparing. And then the second one, it relates more kind of to circularity, which you also mentioned in terms of resources. One thing you mentioned was policy, land use policy. You pointed out there in one of your slides, and there are also other resource policies that are in play that have major influences on these. Now, I don't know anything about the policies in Lebanon per se, but those policies have to do with energy and water and land and economics and all of these things that are kind of making the system even more complex, as you correctly pointed out. So I wondered if you're considering the other resource policy issues as well.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you. Absolutely. On the nutritional side, we were looking at calories and we were looking at nutrition indicators for the diet. So the starting point, we looked at what is a healthy diet for an individual, for a family, and that was the starting point in building the scenarios. So the health was in our mind at the beginning, building those scenarios, because we did not build it only on the quantities you need. We build it on what is the recommended protein nutritional need per person. So that was the beginning of the analysis. We did not take it far enough. We should. I mean, this is another study that I hope will continue that look into adherence. So our starting point was the Eat Lancet report diet, which is the Mediterranean diet, and we looked at that diet from a human nutrition as well as an ecosystem nutrition, and we built on that. But we did not take it far enough in terms of are people adhering to that diet? What are the other needs in terms of the antioxidants that they may need tomato, not only for the protein, but for other things. So that there could be an expansion of that study. You're absolutely right on the policies. I did mention a little bit about the energy policy at the end and the technology, the incentivizing use of renewable, incentivizing the use of other non-traditional water, because fresh water is gone. We don't have enough fresh water for the future. We need to be looking at other pockets of water. That's not only a technological issue, it's a policy issue that needs to be promoted. So you're absolutely right. The policy is all over the nexus in terms of the water, the energy, the health, the land management, and it needs. So policymakers need to be with us, not at the end. they need to be engaged in designing these studies, and we try to engage them as much as possible.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. That helps. I may have missed that about the calories and the diet and so forth, but that is really important. And I think incorporating health into the Nexus, as you're doing now, I think is really kind of the next phase of things that really needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Good presentation.
Thank you.
Mohtar,
Thank you.
on behalf of the Borlaug Institute for International Agriculture and Development, thank you so very much for being our speaker. Greatly appreciate it. And we look forward to having the opportunity of working with you collaboratively in the future. And we wish everyone a very pleasant day. We're looking forward to having the opportunity of having these in person again. Thank you all for
Thank you so
signing
much.
up.